The story of Atlas is often told as a punishment, a titan forced to hold up the sky for eternity. But the story is more than that. It's about what happens when responsibility never ends, when strength becomes expectation, when the thing you carry slowly becomes who you are. This isn't just a myth, it's a reflection of something more familiar. When does responsibility become a burden? Some responsibilities begin as choices. They are taken on willingly, sometimes even with a sense of purpose or pride. At the beginning, they feel manageable. They feel like something that can be carried, something that adds structure, something that creates meaning. But over time, something begins to change. The responsibility does not stay the same size. It grows, it accumulates, it becomes something heavier than it was when it began. And at a certain point, it stops feeling like something chosen and starts feeling like something that cannot be put down. The story of Atlas is not just about punishment. It is about what happens when responsibility becomes a burden, and what that shift does to the person carrying it. Atlas is not originally defined by the weight he carries. He is a titan, part of a generation that existed before the Olympian gods took control. He is powerful, capable, and part of a system that once held authority over the world. But that system does not last. The war between the Titans and the Olympians ends in defeat for Atlas and those aligned with him. And like many figures in mythology, that defeat does not simply remove him from power. It transforms his role entirely. Instead of ruling, instead of acting, he is given something else to do, something permanent. Atlas is sentenced to hold up the sky, not for a moment, not for a defined period of time. There is no indication that this task will ever end. It is not framed as something he will complete. It is framed as something he will continue. And that difference matters because it removes the idea of progress. There is no point where the weight becomes lighter. There is no point where the responsibility is finished. It exists without an endpoint, which changes how it functions. It is no longer something that can be endured for a period of time. It becomes something that defines existence itself. At first, it is easy to view this as a punishment in the traditional sense, a consequence for opposing the gods, a way of ensuring that Atlas can no longer act against them. But the nature of the punishment reveals something deeper. He is not destroyed. He is not removed. He is made to continue, but in a way that limits everything else. His strength is not taken away. It is used. His ability is not diminished. It is redirected into something that cannot be escaped. And that is what transforms the responsibility into a burden. It is not just the weight itself. It is the permanence of it. Over time, the distinction between Atlas and what he carries begins to disappear. He is no longer simply someone holding up the sky. He becomes the one who holds it. The role replaces the identity. There is no version of him that exists outside of that task anymore. And that is where the story begins to connect beyond mythology. Because this kind of shift does not require something as extreme as holding up the sky to occur. It happens in smaller ways, in everyday structures, in roles that begin as manageable and gradually become defining. People take on responsibilities all the time. Work, family, expectations, roles that feel necessary or even meaningful at the beginning. And for a while they function the way they are supposed to. They create stability, they create direction, they provide a sense of purpose. But over time, those responsibilities begin to accumulate. They do not remain isolated, they stack on top of each other, and as they do, they become harder to separate. What once felt like a choice begins to feel like an obligation, and eventually it can begin to feel like something that cannot be set aside without consequence. This is where the transition happens. Not suddenly, not in a dramatic moment, but gradually. The responsibility grows heavier, not because it changes all at once, but because it continues without interruption. There is no clear point where it shifts from something manageable to something overwhelming. It simply continues long enough that the weight becomes normal, even as it increases. And because it becomes normal, it becomes harder to question. It becomes something that is accepted rather than evaluated. Atlas represents that point where questioning is no longer part of the process. The task is not something he can reconsider. It is something that exists as part of him, and that is what makes it different from a temporary burden. Temporary weight can be endured because it has an end. Permanent weight changes how a person exists within it. It reshapes how they think, how they act, and how they understand themselves. It becomes less about carrying something and more about being defined by it. There is a moment in the myth where Atlas interacts with Heracles, and that moment reveals something important. For a brief time, Atlas is given the opportunity to step away from the weight. Heracles offers to hold the sky while Atlas retrieves something in his place. And in that moment, something changes. The weight is no longer constant. There is a separation between Atlas and the burden he has been carrying, and that separation creates a realization that could not exist before. It shows what it feels like to not carry it, even if only briefly. But that moment does not last. Atlas attempts to leave the responsibility behind to avoid returning to the role that has defined him, and that reaction is not difficult to understand. Once something has been carried long enough to become part of identity, the opportunity to step away from it does not feel like a small change. It feels like a complete shift. But the structure does not allow it. The responsibility returns to him, and with it, the role that cannot be separated from who he has become. This is where the story reveals its core idea. The weight itself is not the only issue. It is the inability to put it down. Responsibility becomes a burden when it continues without pause, when it grows without being reduced, and when it becomes something that defines identity rather than supports it. And once that happens, stepping away is no longer simple. It feels like losing something that has been built over time, even if that something is difficult to carry. That pattern exists outside of mythology in ways that are less visible but just as real. People become known for what they carry. They become the reliable one, the strong one, the one who can handle more than others. And over time, that expectation reinforces itself. It becomes something that is assumed rather than asked. And because it is assumed, it becomes harder to step away from it. Not because it is impossible, but because it feels like something that cannot be changed without affecting everything else connected to it. The difficulty is not just in the weight itself, it is in the way that weight becomes tied to identity. Once something is carried long enough, it begins to feel like it is part of who someone is, and that makes it harder to separate the responsibility from the person. It makes it harder to see where one ends and the other begins. And when that boundary disappears, the burden becomes something that feels permanent, even if it is not meant to be. Atlas does not collapse under the weight. That is not the point of the story. He continues to carry it, and that continuation is what makes it meaningful, because it shows that the issue is not always whether something can be carried. It is whether it should be carried indefinitely, without change, without relief, without the ability to step away. The strength required to hold something does not remove the impact of holding it. It only allows it to continue. That is the question the story leaves behind. Not whether responsibility is necessary, because it often is. Not whether it creates meaning, because it can. But at what point it stops being something chosen and becomes something that cannot be put down. At what point it shifts from structure into weight, from purpose into pressure. Because that shift does not announce itself. It happens gradually, over time, until the difference between carrying something and being defined by it is no longer clear. Atlas is remembered as the figure who holds up the sky. That is what defines him. But the story behind that image is not just about punishment or strength. It is about the transformation of responsibility into burden, and what happens when that burden becomes something that cannot be separated from identity. And once that happens, the question is no longer whether the weight can be carried. It is whether it was ever meant to be carried forever.